So hi everyone, thank you again for joining us today, and thank you Amy and Tushar for speaking. Amy, I know you've spoken a few times in the past, but Tushar, I believe this is your first time speaking, correct?
That's correct, yes.
Yeah, so it's great to have you guys. So Amy Davies is the founder and CEO of First 30 Inc., offering advanced onboarding and outplacement services to businesses. She's also the author of A Spark in the Dark, illuminating your path to a brilliant career in a reorg world. Before establishing First 30 in North America, Amy lives in the UK and Europe, working with the global organizations including Unilever, Mars, and Granger. Tushar Anandasagar is an associate in Gowling WLG's Employment, Labor, and Equalities Group. His practice focuses exclusively on the management side of employment, labor, human rights, and privacy law. Thanks again for speaking today, guys, and good luck with your presentation.
Thank you.
Thanks, Alex.
And thanks to everyone for joining us today. I just have a couple slides to go through, and then we are going to go through some questions that we were sent in advance, but also we would love to hear from you if you have some questions you want. I say us, but when I say us, I really mean Tushar, because he is clearly the expert. I did the great job of bringing him here, but he'll do the great job of fielding your questions when it comes to, some of the legal safeguards. COVID, as we all know, has changed the world. And the way that I look at it is, and this was the first quote I put in my book, and it's so true today, right? We're looking around the entire world. There's so much that's the same, but we are lost. And, it's sessions like these that can help as a guiding light to help us understand what to do in these very difficult times. And when you're an HR leader, of course, you want to safeguard your employees' interests as well, but you also want to protect your business. So we are here to take your questions. For those of you, I know that I got a great introduction just there, but I'll just quickly introduce myself. You'll be seeing me in a minute when I stop sharing my screen, but I hope that we can meet one day in person. I'm getting my COVID vaccine soon. So I have worked in the UK and North America for corporate and supplier side. I wrote the book a few years ago and then launched First 30, which is an outplacement company. And our goal was really to make that outplacement very accessible so that every company can afford to put every employee through a fantastic outplacement experience. I decided that when they asked me to speak at this conference today and speaking with my clients and HR leaders, I know that these are some of the topics that we really want to cover. Oops, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself here. I'm trying to stop sharing my screen. We wanted to get ahead, oh gosh, sorry. Am I back? I'm not sharing my screen anymore. We really wanted to run a session that would help the HR community in case you had questions. And we've got some to get us started, but there is a chat. So if you do have questions, please add those. So for our first question, and thank you so much for agreeing to accompany me here today, Tushar.
Oh, it's my absolute pleasure. Thanks so much for inviting me. It's really looking forward to the session. There's always a couple of really tough questions coming from you, Amy.
I do that on purpose. I try to make them hard, so it is tough for you.
I'm ready for the curveballs. Bring them on.
Well, Tushar and I asked you that tough question yesterday. If anyone has any questions about their pet dog, I got a puppy not long ago, and Tushar, you've got your dog's, is it Carrie? Carrie's 3 years old, right?
Just about, yeah.
Yeah, so you were giving me some great veterinary advice yesterday with many disclaimers, I might add. So if you have any questions about your dog, you can also ask those. So the first question we have here is, how often should I get my employment agreements legally reviewed? And, this also falls right into the context of COVID and all the, complications it's introduced for businesses. So maybe you might have different advice for now versus any other time.
Absolutely, Amy. And that's a fantastic question, something that comes up quite literally every day. And so I think a really good reference point before we sort of dive into how often, it's self-serving to ask a lawyer how often you should call a lawyer or ask a vet how often you should call the vet. And so, there it is. And so there's that to consider. But I just want to circle in on this COVID aspect, because if we look at this from the standpoint of risk and liability for an employer, we all know it's common cause that, we have this doctrine under non-unionized workplaces called wrongful dismissal, and there are a couple of offshoots. There's wrongful dismissal, there's constructive dismissal. There is this common law reasonable notice versus Employment Standards Act, or ESA. And so if we look at the risks and liabilities that are facing an employer, and these predate COVID by a significant period, they haven't dropped off because of COVID-19. In fact, in some circumstances, they've actually, without being overtly blunt about this, the courts have actually stated in as many terms that, look, an employer's obligation is to account for financial changes, to account for, the 2007, 2008, 2009 financial crisis was a great example of this, to account for the ebbs and flows of the economy, and to design contracts accordingly. And so all of which is to say, an employer is not going to get a break because of COVID-19. An employer is not going to be, cut slack because of COVID-19. And so when we're talking about having your employment contracts reviewed, I think a good reference point is, has it been within the course of the past year since the start of the pandemic? And if the answer is no, haven't had them reviewed in the course of the past year, you might want to consider contacting your lawyer. I'd be happy to help. Don't want to step on anyone's toes. But it's a good practice generally to have your contracts reviewed at least once a year, but particularly so during the course of this pandemic.
Yeah, that's really good advice. And actually, one question that comes to mind, and it's not on my list here, but it's, if you're updating your employment agreements, presumably those are only for the employees that you are bringing into the business. So new employees, you can't go back and edit old employer agreements. Am I right in that, or is that not correct?
Yes and no. Yes and no. So there are ways to edit an employment agreement, and we can talk about some of the mechanisms for doing so. But technically, a contract is a contract. If you sign a contract with Rogers, for instance, not going to comment on outages or anything.
Don't talk about Rogers.
I'm not going to talk about Rogers. So if you are signing a contract for a period of time, and it says X is the term, and these are the terms of the contract, it's a binding legal document. It's a contract. And in terms of employment, I just want to flag the one specific point, which is, it's technically not a requirement under law to actually have an employment contract in writing. It can be a verbal employment contract. But the reason that we go in the direction of requiring employees to sign contracts, existing employees, is because usually there is some sort of cost consequence for not doing so. In the specific context of employment, we're looking at the employment relationship, we're looking at this risk on the back end on termination of common law reasonable notice, right? So you've heard this tossed around, 1 month, 1+ month per year of service for an employee who's exiting the organization. That can be really expensive for small to medium-sized enterprise, particularly in the context of a pandemic. That can be very costly. So there are mechanisms in place for varying, let's call it, or amending the contract, but it has to be done the right way, and there's a sequence of events that has to occur in order for that to be binding.
Okay, because I'm just thinking that some employers, and I've had this brought up to me in the past, is that some employers now with COVID, and some of them may want to mandate, there's a big debate around that too, but if they want proof of vaccination, that's something they can put in a new employee agreement, but then it might be the more difficult one to revise with their current employees. So that's kind of, looking at it through the COVID lens. That's where my kind of thought was.
Definitely. And it's a lot easier to bind a new employee to terms of employment because they're coming in fresh at the start of a relationship. But if you set an expectation for an existing employee, if you set an expectation that X are the terms of employment, these are the terms here, and then we try to change those terms, that's where we get into issues. And so, a lot easier to do it at the start of the relationship, and then a lot harder to do it sort of midstream.
Yes, yes. I'm thinking of a lot of areas where that applies, Tushar.
Oh yeah, we're not going to get into all that. We'll keep it to dogs and cats and fun stuff. Yeah,
right. Characters. Okay, so you might have answered this already, but have there been any recent changes that could affect the validity of employment agreements?
I would say yes, and this is part of the reason why, to answer the first question, I said, look, I mean, maybe we want to consider whether or not it's been amended within the course of the past 12 months. Let's say there have been some recent decisions by, particularly the Ontario Court of Appeal. I know that there's some folks who might have employees outside of Ontario, but we'll focus on Ontario for now. This is an Ontario event, so we're looking at a recent decision of the Ontario Court of Appeal where they actually said that there were some offending provisions within an employment agreement which stated that the employer could terminate the individual's employment for just cause without notice, right? That's a fairly common concept. The concept of for cause or just cause, it's the new hot button issue for the courts in Ontario. And we're seeing this pop up time and again, because for 20 plus years, the courts have enforced agreements that have said, we will give you the ESA if we terminate you without notice, but if we terminate you, if we terminate you on notice, right? So it's a without cause termination. But if we terminate you for just cause, right? If there's cause for termination, we're going to do it on no notice. And so that actually violates the Employment Standards Act. That's not a commonly known fact until the past 12 months or so, when it became a higher profile issue because of the number of layoffs, because of the number of terminations that were occurring. And so the reason for that is there is a specific provision within the Employment Standards Act, or a regulation under the Employment Standards Act, which says that in order to terminate somebody's employment without notice, and I'll summarize here without sort of reading the statute to you, but in order to terminate someone without notice, they have to have engaged in something called willful misconduct, which is different from just cause. Willful misconduct over here, just cause over here, and the courts are saying that these two concepts don't mesh. And so if your employment contracts say, we as employer get to terminate you without notice if we have just cause, that employment contract may no longer be enforceable, even if it was just entered into as of Jan 1 of 2020 before the pandemic. And so that's a really good reason to contact your legal counsel and have your contracts reviewed.
That is a really good reason to contact legal counsel, because I'm sure that there are a lot of employers who don't know that, right? And the HR leaders, when they're writing their employment agreements, don't realize that, because it feels like a subtle difference when you look at it at face value, but when you dig in, it can have quite serious consequences for an organization if they get that wrong.
Oh, absolutely. Yes. And it really comes into play as we're looking at these longer service employees who are 15, 20-year employees, and trying to contain that liability is really an issue, especially when cash flow might be limited as a result of reductions of business in the course of a pandemic, a 100-year pandemic, right? So, and again, building off of that initial discussion point that we had, the courts aren't cutting employers slack because there's a 100-year pandemic. They're expecting employers to have made the adjustment in order to account for these changes, and it terminated employees in a worse position than an employer that continues to operate in some sense. So they're not cutting slack for companies because the contract says just cause, even though for the last 20 years we've had enforceable contracts, and oh my goodness, what are we doing now? So that's a really valid reason, and one of the recent changes that I would say is one of the most significant and important ones for an employer moving forward. And probably a good reason to revisit some of those existing contracts, the ongoing long-term relationships that you want to amend over the course of employment.
Yeah, because when you're talking, it's worrying, right? Because ignorance is not a defense if you're in a circumstance where you're in a legal situation, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, so the next question, we actually talked about this one, if new terms can be introduced for an existing employee. And so I think we might skip that one unless there's anything else you wanted to add to that.
I think we've covered it off. Maybe just a brief mention of the mechanism. Amy, I know that we have a couple more people who just logged in. We're stealing people from the other sessions. Please feel free, come on in. So so for existing employees, that's the difficult one. There's this mechanism that has to be in place, and I'm not going to belabor it. We've already kind of covered it off, sort of. I will just mention that in order to bind a long-term relationship employee to a new employment agreement, they need to get something, in simple terms, they need to get something that they didn't already have before they at the time they're offered the contract on new terms. It could be a signing bonus or something like that. So the sequencing is important. They are presented with the terms, they get something that they didn't have after they sign the terms. If you give them something and then get them to sign the terms, that could pose an issue. And so it's really important to kind of work within the parameters of the law there and sort of implement that change, because again, these courts, the minor defects, the small, microscopic little defects will potentially invalidate a contract.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah, that's a great clarification. Thank you. All right, so we're talking a lot about vaccinations and people who are pro and people who are anti-vaccination. So the question is, can I ask someone if they are an anti-vaxxer during a job interview? I would like to add to that, can I ask them if they have been vaccinated during an interview?
I think that's a great question, and that's a tough one, Amy. I mean, this is the hot button issue of this particular time. So I'll start with saying that, there are enumerated and protected grounds under our human rights legislation, the Human Rights Code in Ontario, and there's the equivalents in other jurisdictions. They actually limit the questions and the discriminatory questions that we could possibly ask during the course of a job interview. Now, that's not to say that this won't be possible, depending on the specific facts and circumstances of each case. Let's think about blue sky examples. For instance, a pilot. If the pilot can't get off the plane in another country that the pilot is flying to, and the pilot basically has to set up shop on the plane for 12 hours and then fly back to another country, and maybe that's one of these situations where this question will be permissible, right? So I think we have to approach this, early days, and we're operating without the benefit of our Supreme Court weighing in and the human rights tribunals and whatnot, and we're still in a place where the vaccines are theoretically available, because they're not quite, I don't have mine yet. Everyone around me seems to have theirs, but I don't have mine yet. I think lawyers will probably be like the end line, last on the yeah. They know not to vaccinate us. We probably have too many lawyers out there anyway. But at the end of the day, it's circumstantial. I think at this point, we look at this as a possible ask that may work in certain circumstances, but in other contexts, it could very well be discrimination.
Yeah, and I don't know if you guys have ever, I know if anyone in the session today, you guys have a great blog, Gowling, on the Gowling WLG site, and you have articles that you post. That's how I originally found you guys. So, one really interesting article, unless you've written it already, because it's always a difficult one, what questions are illegal? I'm not asking you that now, because I know that's not really the topic of today, but questions in an interview that are illegal. And I think that there's a lot of confusion about that. There's a lot of changes, and there's some questions that have been determined illegal on a federal level, not on a provincial level. So that's always another great topic to dig into at another session.
Absolutely. No, wonderful. Yeah. And you know what, those questions, there's one particular case that comes to mind. It involved a large oil company, but if you can imagine years of liability for a pre-employment, let's call it a misstep. And so there are some landmines there that we can definitely go over, and maybe an idea for a later session.
Yeah, for sure. Because I work on helping people who've been laid off get back to work, and they ask a lot. This is a big question that comes up, and then they want to know how to handle those questions as well. But there's a big question mark on the other side, because sometimes it is purely ignorance, and people aren't realizing. Someone's asking here what website they look at for those questions. Well, we're hoping that Gowling has a blog coming up soon, but they definitely have a lot of articles, as does First 30. So first30ready.com. You can go there if you're interested in learning more and more resources.
Definitely. And on the Gowling side, Barbara, we actually have a section of our website called Insights. And so if you click on the Insights, there's a specific section titled COVID-19 and what does it mean for my business? And so if you go through there, we've got everything under the sun right from the start of the pandemic, from temperature testing right through to whether we can mandate vaccination. So
this is a really interesting one, and one I'm hearing a lot about both on the CBC and from clients about creating a vaccination incentive policy. We have here for new hires. If so, what kinds of vaccinations incentives can I use?
That's a fantastic question, Amy. So a vaccination incentive, and maybe we can sort of here we go. We've got some links to the website, and we've got a compliant anti-spam legislation questionnaire that you'll be asked. So it's an opt-in. We're not gonna send you emails at 4 in the morning unless you want to. So so vaccination incentives. It's a hot button issue because we're operating now in a sense in a legal vacuum because our provincial government, the federal government, we don't have permissive legislation which says that employer can say to an employee, you cannot come to work unless you prove that you've been vaccinated. And so, that is sort of the operative presumption here. Vaccination incentives are a way to sort of work around that particular issue. What they do is they actually create an opt-in type, where it's funny that we're talking about spam because you opt in to disclose as an employee to your employer under this policy that you have been vaccinated, and you provide a proof of vaccination. Whether or not the employer keeps it is really up to the employer if it's necessary or not. That's a longer form answer. But at the end of the day, the incentive can take whatever form the business would like. It can be a cash incentive. It could be it could be time off in lieu. Now, I wouldn't go so far as to hand out hats to people saying, been vaccinated. That might be a little bit of a red flag. But they're within the parameters of reason. You can set up a vaccination incentive policy that basically allows individuals to come in and say, I've been vaccinated. You can give them time off work during their vaccination appointments. There are a variety of different forms that this can take. I will say this. In theory, there is a possibility of a human rights type claim because there are individuals who may not be able to be vaccinated. But as long as the policy or the program, whatever you want to call it, takes that into account and has systems in place to deal with accommodations and questions like that, we view this as a relatively low risk proposition. And again, I think context is super important because in January of 2020, if somebody came up to me and held a temperature gun up to my head, I would have said,
Yeah.
And so much has changed since then. So, yeah.
A lot has changed. And I know that your colleague, Nina Gupta, was recently on TVO on, I forget what show she was on, but it would be worth connecting with you both on LinkedIn for people because I know it was posted, and I also posted that interview about vaccine passports. COVID vaccine passports. And wow, what an interesting conversation and debate that was. It's only 30 minutes and definitely worth checking out for people who have a lot of questions because we're talking about incentives. The thing is sometimes the incentives may fall outside of the workplace. If you want to go on your annual holiday in another country, you'll have to get your COVID vaccine in order to enter that country. So there'll be incentives that aren't necessarily workplace related.
Absolutely, Amy. And what is a vaccine passport? What form does it take, right? We don't even have that clarity from our governments and whatnot. So it's going to be a really interesting issue. And I think that's where we will be. Vaccination and distribution, supply chain, all that stuff is where we are now. But the really great thing about Nina's interview is where we will be. And the issues that we'll face over the next couple of months. So highly recommend checking that out. It's TVO. I believe it was The Hour with Steve Paikin.
That's correct.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay. Can I include a clause in my offer letters requiring new hires to prove that they have been vaccinated? So we're dancing around this one, and now we've got the kind of direct question. So what would you say to that right now?
I think at this stage, we're still, back in that early days position, right? We're looking at this through the lens of a legal vacuum. And I think that, if we look at this with that pilot example in mind, it really can depend on the role, and we may be able to do this at some point, and we may be able to do it for some specific roles. So the pilot example is a good one because the individual wouldn't be able to get off a plane. It really depends on the facts and circumstances. And at this point in time, we don't have a lot of guidance from the courts, but I do think that at some stage we will have guidance from the courts that says, look, I mean, these are the realities of the situation. We're dealing with a 100-year pandemic. This will be permissible at some stage.
Yes, yeah, and it's very different from the views that courts have taken in the past, from my understanding. So there'll be a little less sympathy. And I'm listening to you and Nina over the past number of weeks, so I'm picking up on what you guys are saying, but it sounds very realistic to me. Now, we don't have a lot of time left because we've only got 30 minutes here, and we're down to our 5 minutes. But I do want to ask this question because I think it's one on everyone's mind. Should my contracts, my employment agreement contracts, be modified to permit work from home? I have a question though too, like to add to this is like, what if people are like, I'm not coming back in. I've worked successfully from home for the last year and a bit. I want to be able to do my laundry during the day and pick my kids up from school.
That is the question, probably one of the more difficult ones, because most of the people that are tuning in under this province-wide stay-at-home order are working from home in some capacity. And so that question, how do I put the toothpaste back in the tube, is probably something that comes up at least once a week on our side. So contracts, they can be modified, right? We know that it's common cause. Contracts, policies, work from home policies, they can be modified. So I would say, if you want to bind somebody to return to the workplace at some point in time, whenever that point may be, whether it's in 21 or 22 or 23, we don't know that. I wish I had that crystal ball, because then I would start booking my vacations now and take advantage of these prices, or just buy a beach resort. But basically, if the contract can be modified to permit work from home, it can also be modified to revoke work from home privileges and require an individual to come back into the workplace. Now, there are some caveats involved. As any good legal practitioner will say, it depends on the circumstances. If we've got childcare obligations or under protected grounds under the Human Rights Code, we might have limitations there. But in theory, we can actually restrict an individual's ability to continue working from home in perpetuity in the same way that we allow it.
Right, that's really good, and this is going to be a very hot topic coming up. I am going to have to cut the questions short there, because I want to make sure that we've got, everyone can get all of your information. So thank you. Can you see my screen?
I can, yes.
Okay, great. So thank you so much. You are amazing. I always get so excited when we run sessions with you guys, because you always have so much information, and just I want to make sure that anyone gets, to write down your email address. They can contact you if they have specific questions relating to their organization and they need legal counsel. They can reach out to you. First 30 has some upcoming sessions. So we have a copy and law session with Tushar's colleague, Nina Gupta, on Thursday. This is also about employment agreements. So we'll build on a lot of the conversation we're having today. We've got some great replays on the site about the COVID vaccine and policy, company policy. There's one on overcoming toxic people in the workplaces. So you can look at all of our resources there. We've also got an onboarding and layoffs guide, a COVID vaccine communications template, and we just released a blog on with Gowling WLG about can employers make the COVID vaccine mandatory in the workplace. So you can check that all out on First 30. I know that the Gowling site was put up as well. They've got some great resources. If you are going through layoffs, you're more than welcome to reach out and we can talk about your specific situation. But that said, thank you so much. I know we're out of time. I'm going to stop sharing here and just wave goodbye to everybody. There. Thank you again, and thank you. We were so happy to be here today.
Thanks so much, Amy, and thanks everyone for tuning in.
Take care.